And how long did it take you to, step by step create a method?
In the beginning, when I passed the exam, without much preparation but with much sincerity and much dedication, I was watching the self at work, because that is what my philosopher friend had wanted me to do, and I dipped very deeply into the teachings of J. Krishnamurti, and I began to watch the movement of the self, and I found that the self is the architect of suffering, inner suffering, and I went on watching for a period of intensely 6 months to begin with. It is not that I was jobless at that time. I was a young researcher at a research institute in India, and I had to pass my graduate courses and I had to do my assignments, and I was definitely lagging behind. Why? Because while most students would have prioritized their worldly concerns over the spiritual concern, I put my spiritual concern first, because I became aware that something is amiss in consciousness, and that the master had convinced me, Krishnamurti, that to attend to it is the most important thing. Watching the self at work, and now the watching the self at work is more easily said and described than it happening naturally. So in the beginning, invariably, there was the activation of effort getting into the important act of watching, which is not the watching the master is alluding to. The master is telling you that there should be no choice, there should be no judgment, there should be no criticism, there should be no condemnation, and even the desire to watch is a distraction, you won't be able to watch. These are the things that the master is saying. So in the beginning, very many wrong watchings had to come to pass, and then I found to my dismay that the watching began to happen by itself, without the self making a determination or an effort to watch. And that most people are actually looking outward for the causes of their suffering and for the solutions of their suffering. They're looking outward. That is, they hold somebody to be a villain and somebody to be the perpetrator of suffering. And then they think that if I pray and if I do this puja and if I go to the counselor, then my suffering will go away. So they're looking basically outward. And what is so radical about Krishnamurti is that he asks you to turn inward. Now, to begin with, it's terra incognito. You don't even know what that word means, to turn inward. And then, because you're so sincere and you're dedicated, then suddenly the turning inward happens. And instead of looking at outer things, somehow the watching of the self started in a very genuine way. It was not a watching which lasted 30 minutes by the clock, nothing like that, because the self is not all the time there for you to watch. It's like a monkey, it comes and goes. It is flitting and jumping. So whenever the self is reacting, whenever the self is in a judgmental spree, then the watching has to happen. Then what do you learn? You learn that the self is fundamentally evil, and it's the architect of suffering, and unknowingly it runs after hundreds of things, hoping that they will give it succor and pleasure, and that may not be the case at all. And then I found that as I'm watching after having turned inward, now the moment you turn inward, then mainstream society is not going to be encouraging of you, because mainstream society wants you to attend to all the outer obligations which you are expected to dispose of.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And therefore, immediately you become an outsider in that mainstream society. Your friends may become critical of you. Your friends may not approve of your meditative orientation, that you are spending a lot of time in solitude, that you prefer to spend time in solitude rather than in the company of your friends who are happy-go-lucky. But you start watching. As I started watching, I found that this, at one point, there was a decisive flash of an insight, and that insight was, every effort made by the self in the inner field of consciousness is futile and not fruitful for you. It's an insight which just flashed. And that very moment when that insight flashed, from that moment onwards, every kind of struggle, every kind of effort just dropped out by itself. There's no inner effort. Inner effort to do what? To succeed in life. Inner effort to do what? To become somebody in life. Inner effort to pursue the pleasure. So I never went to the movies with my friends. I never went out to eat ice cream with my friends because the whole momentum just stopped.
So you mean observation doesn't require any effort?
No. There is an observation which is effort driven initially, but that is a kind of wrong effort. It's much like a very young boy learning to get balance on a bicycle by having training wheels. The training wheels are the effort. Now, so long as you have the training wheels, you've not got your balance. But sooner or later, you're going to dispense with the training wheels and you're going to just ride away in good balance. Neither swerving to the right nor swerving to the left, but in very good balance. You got the balance. But initially, you need help. So you will make a number of false efforts, and all the efforts will be fruitless. And that's not watching at all, because the self itself is making the effort, and the self has to watch itself. So it's a paradoxical thing. And then it becomes silent. But then now the question is, it becomes silent, and then I don't know if I should go more deeply into it, because it's I don't know if I teach this in the retreats, because this is for people who have admitted that there is suffering, and they're very earnest in wanting to solve that problem in such a way that they will never meet with the face of suffering again in their life. It's for them. So what we may call the initiated ones.
But that is most of humanity. If they are willing to, if they can avoid suffering by putting in a year or two's effort, then that is...
It's not part of our culture. You see, you're able to do, you're willing to take an effort, and you're willing to dedicate yourself always in a piecemeal way. You're prepared to go to a church father, you're prepared to go to a guru, you're prepared to attend a retreat, and you're prepared to study some scriptures. But that is not what Krishnamurti is talking about. Krishnamurti is asking you to turn inward, and Krishnamurti is asking you to be your own teacher, which is a little new to the whole culture, is so new to us. And then to understand the ulterior motives of the self is not innocent. There are ulterior motives, and the ulterior motives actually get you into trouble, and the trouble is the suffering. And so the whole thing, the journey goes like that. And the final chapter of the self-knowing is that the self gets into its last agonies when it is not beaten once or twice, but it is beaten again and again, say 3 times or 4 times. Then the self is so badly wounded by the blows of fate or by the blows of suffering that the self is practically writhing in its last agonies. It's writhing. And then this is where...
You say that's a very good thing, right?
It's considered a very bad thing. It's considered an extremely bad thing, and it's considered a pathology, and nobody is going to come to your side listening to the story. But then the master is giving a new teaching. The master is saying that the dying of the self is the greatest blessing in life. And how does it happen? The self has to see that it is the architect of its own inner suffering, and it does not have a single piece of straw to hang on to anymore. Its tenure is over, and therefore this self, which is but one onion peel, it's not wholly who you are. You are actually the divine soul, but you don't know that yet, and all you know is this entangled piece of that divine soul in the consciousness country. And so by writhing in pain and going through the last agonies, it yields to suffering very gracefully, becomes very vulnerable, and then through an emotional catharsis, it just goes to pieces.